"Don't bury him, he's still breathing," the stable hand's daughter shouted at the rancher by barn up on an ordinary morning at a ranch in rural America. A prized horse collapses during training, and everyone believes it's dead. When the powerful rancher decides to fix the problem quickly, the stable girl sees something no one else notices. Her desperate cry changes everything and exposes truths that ranch has never faced. The accident at dawn. Dawn broke slowly in rural Wyoming, as if the sun were too lazy to break through the chill that blanketed the landscape. The orange light first touched the peaks of distant mountains, then glided across the open fields, revealing the thin layer of dew that glistened on each blade of grass. The air was cold enough to sting the nose, and there was the strong smell of damp earth mixed with the fainter odor of old straw emanating from the main barn. Ranch workers appeared, one by one, walking with heavy steps, adjusting their thick jackets as the familiar sounds of the morning mingled, buckets banging against the wood, metal gates creaking, hooves thumping on the hard-packed earth, and the muffled murmur of still sleepy voices discussing the day's tasks. Nora Harper walked slowly down the narrow corridor between the stables, clutching a small plastic container full of chicken feed in both hands, a scratched, dirt-stained container she used every day. She was only 6 years old, but she moved with an almost adult calm, always observing before speaking, always paying attention to the little things adults missed. Her perpetually tangled red hair fell haphazardly over her shoulders, and her bangs almost hid her large, attentive, and silent eyes. She was the first to wake in the simple house where she lived with her parents, who had worked in the stables long before she was born. Every morning was the same, but to Nora it always felt new. She loved the sound of the first doors opening, the mingled smell of leather and hay, and how the cold air made her flannel coat feel heavier. While everyone else was still waking up, she was already fully awake. She walked, her fingertips brushing against the rough boards of the stalls, feeling the texture, as if it were her silent way of saying good morning to the horses that were still dozing. She liked to notice which one was more restless, which one breathed more slowly, which one had moved during the night. There was a natural sensitivity in her, something no one had taught her, but which seemed to grow with each sunrise. As she passed through the side door of the larger barn, she slowly raised her head and saw the vapor from the horses' breaths dispersing in the cold air like small, living clouds. It was always the first sign that the morning had truly begun. The workers, still busy with buckets, ropes, and tools, barely noticed the girl's presence. They were used to seeing her there, a small reddish shadow among the paws, the mud, and the hay. However, there was something about her that, even in silence, composed the scenery of that ranch as much as the fences, the pastures, and the wind. That dawn seemed ordinary to everyone, except for Nora, who carried the constant feeling that each morning brought with it something she needed to discover, even if no one else noticed. Silver Dust, the champion horse. Silver Dust was a horse that made the entire ranch breathe differently. The animal wasn't just beautiful, it was imposing. A quarter horse with an almost metallic gray coat, with muscles defined as if sculpted on the long plains of Wyoming. Even those who knew nothing about horses could notice that there was something special about its bearing. The way it held its head high and its ears attentive, always alert to the slightest movement around it. Since arriving at the ranch, Silver Dust had become the pride of rancher John McCready, winning competitions, attracting buyers, and captivating the eyes of anyone passing by the stable. That morning, however, something was not as usual. Miguel, the ranch hand responsible for training Silver Dust since early morning, appeared with a worried look. He walked beside the horse, holding the reins gently, but keeping his body firm to control any sudden movements. The cold wind blowing between the hills was too strong for that hour, and Silver Dust reacted to each gust with a firm stomp, raising small clouds of dust His breath came out heavy, hot, forming steam before his muzzle. It wasn't fear, but unease, as if some ancient instinct was telling the animal that something was wrong. Miguel spoke to him constantly, in a mixture of broken English and brief words in Spanish, trying to calm the growing tension in the animal's body. Silverdust arched his neck, pulling on the reins, and his dark eyes darted rapidly from side to side, as if analyzing the surrounding field. Workers passing by made quick comments, some saying it was just the wind, others noting that champion horses didn't always cope well with such abrupt temperature changes. John McCready, watching from a distance, didn't seem worried. He was more interested in the day's schedule, the overdue tasks, and the fact that Silverdust needed to train early if he wanted to maintain the excellent performance of the previous week. Nora, who was walking near the smaller stables, saw the horse even before she heard the loudest sound of its hooves. She stopped immediately, as she always did when Silverdust appeared. It wasn't fear, it was fascination. Her breathing slowed as she watched the animal's movements. Almost no one understood, but Silverdust always changed his breathing rhythm when something bothered him. Nora noticed. She noticed everything. And that morning, unlike the adults, he felt something like a warning, not a supernatural warning, but the kind of feeling a child growing up among animals naturally develops. Something told her the horse was too tense, too different. Before he could fully understand, Miguel pulled Silverdust toward the training field. The horse stamped its hooves forcefully, kicking up dust, as if trying to sweep away whatever was troubling it, and Nora, with her little pot still in her hands, stood motionless at the edge of the path, watching as the wind made the horse's gray mane scatter in all directions, almost like a flag announcing a tragedy that no one could yet see. It turns out abrupt. The training field was a few meters from the main barn, a wide area of packed earth surrounded by old, sturdy wood. Miguel led Silverdust to the center, trying to get him to take his first lap to warm up his muscles. But from the first step, it was clear that the horse was more tense than usual. He pulled his body forward as if he wanted to run, but recoiled the next second, his hoof striking with a dry snap that echoed in the silent morning. Miguel spoke to him, gently tugged on the reins, gave him space, but nothing seemed to stabilize the animal. It was then that a stronger gust of wind stirred up dust from the ground and made the dry leaves of nearby trees swirl on the ground. Silverdust was startled. It wasn't a jump, it was a full leap. The horse flexed its body, turned its head to the side, and tried to escape what it perceived as danger. The quick movement encountered an invisible obstacle, a small unevenness hidden by the accumulated dust. The hoof struck awkwardly, twisted forcefully, and it all happened in a matter of seconds, but with a crash that seemed to last minutes. Silverdust fell sideways, its immense body hitting the ground with a heavy sound that silenced the entire ranch. Miguel was thrown backward as if pushed by a giant. He rolled twice on the ground before stopping, coughing, and trying to catch his breath. The impact raised a dense cloud of dust that covered the entire field. For a few moments, no one could see what had actually happened. As the dust began to settle, nearby workers rushed into the enclosure. Some called for Miguel, others tried to understand why the horse wasn't moving. Silverdust was completely still. It looked like a fallen statue, its neck stretched out on the ground, and its eyes open, but fixed on nothing. Miguel, still on his knees, coughed and tried to get up, shouting for someone to hold the horse if it tried to stand awkwardly. But Silverdust didn't show the slightest sign of reaction. The workers' expressions changed quickly from shock to silent despair. They knew horses were fragile when it came to falls, especially an animal so strong and so used in competitions. The way the body had hit the ground left everyone hopeless. Murmurs began immediately. Did he break his neck? He's not breathing. This can't be happening. Outside the enclosure, Nora saw everything with painful clarity. While the adults shouted instructions and ran around, she stood still, gripping her food bowl so tightly, her fingers turned white. Her eyes were open, but unblinking. She seemed to feel each second slower than the others. It was as if the whole world had gone silent for her. No sound, no wind, nothing but Silver Dust's enormous body, stretched out on the ground, covered in the fine dust from the fall. And at that moment, without anyone noticing, something very important was about to happen. The farmer assumes the worst. John McCready arrived at the field, practically running. It wasn't common to see him in such a hurry, but the thud of the fall had been so loud that it made him leave the main house before even fully putting on his coat. He jumped the fence, like someone who had done it more times than he should, and rushed to where Silver Dust lay. The workers made way, allowing the boss to get close to the animal, even knowing that none of them really wanted to see up close what seemed to be an inevitable tragedy. John wasn't an emotional man. His reputation in the county was that of someone rigid, direct, and practical, and it was with exactly that cold gaze that he faced Silver Dust. He knelt beside the horse's neck, touched its flank with his glove, ran his hand along its ribcage, and observed the complete absence of movement. There was no sigh, no effort, no response whatsoever. The horse was too still to be alive. John clenched his jaw, frustrated but not surprised. He had known horses since childhood, and what he saw there didn't seem to be a fainting animal, it looked like a dead animal. Miguel tried to say something, still staggering and dazed from the fall, but John raised his hand, signaling for him to be quiet. He didn't want reports, opinions, or theories. He just wanted to resolve this as quickly as possible. Silver Dust was valuable, yes, but now it was just a huge weight in the middle of the field. And John McCready was never one to prolong losses. "He's dead," he said, with a coldness that made some of the workers lower their heads. "Bring the backhoe, we'll bury him behind the barn." It was as if the wind had stopped. Some workers exchanged uneasy glances, as if there was still doubt, but no one dared question the boss's decision. Miguel tried to approach the horse, perhaps looking for a sign that could contradict John, but the farmer took a step forward, blocking him without saying anything. The message was clear, the matter was closed. Workers began rushing to retrieve the equipment. Others walked slowly, with hardened expressions, as if they were about to participate in something inevitably sad. And in the midst of all this, no one noticed the small, red-haired figure standing outside the fence. No one saw that Nora hadn't moved since the moment of the fall, and no one realized that her eyes were fixed on a specific point on the horse's body, as if she were seeing something that no adult had had the patience or sensitivity to notice. Nora notices something different. As the workers began to move away to fetch the backhoe, Nora finally took a step forward. It was just a step, small, but full of intention. She didn't run, she didn't shout, she didn't call out to anyone. She just walked, slowly, as if the ground between her and Silver Dust were made of thin glass. The adults were too busy to notice that the little girl had slipped through the opening in the fence and into the training field. Nora approached the horse with silent respect. She knelt near Silver Dust's head, bracing herself with one hand to avoid slipping on the loose dust. The feed bowl lay forgotten beside her. She leaned forward, bringing her face close to the horse's side, observing its motionless flank. Most people would only glance and confirm the obvious: the horse wasn't moving. But Nora saw what others didn't, because she wasn't looking for a large movement. She was looking for the slightest, almost invisible sign. And she saw, it was such a slight movement that it seemed almost imaginary, but it wasn't. It was real. The horse's flank, exactly above the last rib, made a subtle, almost imperceptible lift. It wasn't rhythm, it wasn't strength, but it was life, albeit fragile and hidden beneath the weight of the fall. Nora's eyes widened, her breath caught for a moment, and her heart raced. She slowly, carefully, brought her hand closer and touched only the tips of her fingers to the same spot where she had seen the slight stretching of the skin. She waited in silence, as if the world had stopped again. And then she felt it, a micro-movement, almost like an internal sigh, like air passing through a narrow tunnel. Silver Dust was alive. The girl knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the horse was still fighting, even if no one else had noticed. The wind blew again, lifting the horse's mane and sending a chill through Nora's body, but she didn't flinch. She brought her face even closer and whispered something so low that no adult could hear, "I am here." It was at that exact moment that she knew she would need to do something no adult would do for her. Something that would completely change the course of that morning at the McCready ranch hand, that would reveal, seconds later, the truth everyone had ignored. "Don't bury him, he's still breathing." The scream that paralyzes the farm. The sound of the backhoe starting up filled the field like a final verdict. The machine let out a deep rumble, and the vibration spread across the hard-packed earth as one of the workers adjusted the seat and pulled the levers with the indifference of someone who had done this many times before. The engine echoed between the barns and woke birds that had hidden from the cold. Everything seemed already decided, and no one had reason to believe that anything could still change. Silver Dust was too still, too cold, too silent. John McCready himself was already preparing to give the final instructions about the hole that would be dug. It was a bad morning, but at least a morning that needed to be resolved. It was then that, suddenly, a scream cut through the air like an unexpected explosion. A scream so loud, so full of something the adults couldn't immediately identify, that it made all the men freeze where they were. The small, thin, but surprisingly firm voice echoed across the field with a force that seemed to come from a body much larger than that of a 6-year-old girl. "Don't bury him, he's still breathing." The echo of the words spread through the enclosures, bounced off the barn walls, and returned to the men's ears as if spoken through a loudspeaker. Several heads turned at once, confused, disconcerted. The backhoe operator instinctively released the levers, making the machine cough before stopping. The dust the engine had kicked up hung in the air, creating a thin mist around the field. And in the middle of that mist was Nora Harper, small, pale, with trembling hands, but with a gaze so determined that no adult could ignore it. John McCready frowned immediately. He didn't like being interrupted, much less a child screaming with that intensity. He walked briskly toward her, indignant, his voice already poised to order someone to forcibly remove her. But before he could say anything, he noticed the men around him were paralyzed, as if they were all waiting to see exactly what had made that little girl believe a clearly dead horse was still breathing. Irritation filled John's face, but there was something even bigger, there, a shadow of doubt he didn't want to admit. "Someone get that girl out of here," he said, in the dry tone that always made the workers move without argument. But nobody moved, because no one had yet understood how a child had found the courage to scream like that, and because for a brief second no one could swear with absolute certainty that she was wrong. A child against authority. Before any adult could reach Nora, she took 2 more steps forward, drawing even closer to Silver Dust's enormous body. She looked tiny beside the fallen horse, like a leaf before a fallen tree trunk. But her movements had such pure conviction that no one could act quickly enough to stop her. It was as if she were obeying something from within, a kind of silent, instinctive courage that isn't afraid of ridicule because it's not trying to prove anything to anyone. The instant the backhoe started moving again, with the operator still uncertain what to do, Nora ran toward it. It wasn't a quick run, but it was determined. She stopped right in front of the metal shovel, spread her arms as wide as she could, keeping her legs firmly planted on the ground, as if the earth had decided to hold her by the roots. The oversized jacket she was wearing fluttered in the cold wind, and her red hair was thrown back like a flame being shaken. The machine operator's eyes widened, and he immediately shut off the engine. He wasn't crazy. He would never risk moving forward with a child in front, no matter who was giving orders on that ranch. The workers stood silently, watching the scene with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. It wasn't common to see someone, much less such a small girl, going against a decision made by John McCready. Nora took a deep breath, still trembling, but without backing down an inch. Her face was red, not from shame, but from exertion, as if that moment demanded more strength from her than anything else in her short life up to that point. When she finally managed to speak, her voice came out low, but clear, as if it had been molded to be heard at that exact second. "He's not dead. He's waiting for someone to help." Each word seemed to weigh more than it should, as if it carried not only the horse's life, but also the responsibility of facing all those adults who were about to make an irreversible mistake. The silence that followed was so profound that the wind could be heard banging against the barn doors, a dry sound that would normally go unnoticed. John stopped, staring at the girl, with what seemed to be a mixture of irritation and bewilderment. No one had ever confronted him like that, much less someone so fragile and insignificant in his eyes. But there was something in the firmness of Nora's gaze that wasn't a challenge, it was truth. A truth she didn't need to prove, because she seemed to simply know it. And this kind of certainty, coming from someone with no power whatsoever, affected everyone present. The farmer checks. John exhaled deeply, trying to maintain his composure. He didn't like wasting time, and even less did he like being challenged. But there was something there that bothered him, a feeling he didn't want to admit, but which clung to him like a weight that was hard to ignore. Maybe it was the paralysis of the workers around him. Maybe it was the absolute silence after Nora's scream. Maybe it was the way the backhoe operator had turned off the machine without a second thought. Or maybe, and he didn't want to accept this, maybe it was the tiny chance that the girl was telling the truth. He walked toward Silver Dust with heavy steps, each one sinking into the soft earth of the training field. The men automatically parted, some averting their gaze, others watching with evident nervousness. Miguel, still limping after the fall, looked at Nora with a mixture of hope and fear, as if that possibility was too beautiful to believe, but too painful to refuse. John knelt beside the horse's head, exactly where Nora had stood minutes before. He removed the glove from his right hand, a rare, almost intimate gesture. He hadn't touched Silver Dust without gloves in a long time. The horse was too valuable for risks, and too personal for sentimentality. But at that moment, John needed to know for sure, and he needed to feel it with his own skin. He brought his hand to the horse's nose, hesitantly, as if about to discover something he'd rather not. The cold muzzle touched his palm, stiff and motionless. John held his breath as he waited for some sign. He looked into the horse's eyes, too wide, too fixed. He ran his hand along its neck, searching for any answer. Nothing. But then, just as he was about to move away, a tiny, almost illusory breath touched his skin. It was so weak that John thought he had imagined it. He brought his ear close to the snout, bracing his hand on the ground to steady himself. He heard it again, a soft, short, irregular sound. It wasn't normal breathing. It was effort. It was struggle. It was life, insisting on continuing, even if almost extinguished. His expression changed immediately. It wasn't a dramatic change. There was no visible shock, no exhilaration. It was an almost imperceptible movement, his jaw loosening, air escaping through his nose in a heavy puff, his gaze vacating for an instant, as if he had just realized the gravity of the mistake he was about to make. He stood up slowly, wiped his hand on his trousers, and looked at the workers. His voice didn't come out strong. As usual, it was tense, urgent, surprisingly human. "He is alive." That sentence fell upon the ranch like a silent thunderclap. Race to save the animal. The moment John confirmed Silver Dust was alive, the entire ranch sprang into motion. But it was a different kind of chaotic movement than the one that precedes an impromptu burial. It was quick, coordinated, desperately hopeful. The workers ran in opposite directions, as if the ranch had awakened from a trance. Some went to get the trailer, others rushed to grab ropes, blankets, support bars, and anything else that could help move an animal of that size without causing further damage. Miguel, even limping, tried to help, but one of the ranch hands held him by the arm to prevent him from falling again. John paced back and forth, his voice now firm, issuing clear orders. It was as if the confirmation of life had activated a part of him that rarely surfaced, a part that didn't see horses as numbers, but as work companions, as a responsibility. Every instruction he gave was followed immediately, and the tension of the moment was so great that no one dared question him. Nora, however, didn't move an inch from the horse. She remained beside Silverdust, kneeling, with one hand resting on the animal's neck. Her palm was cold, but her fingers were warm from the need to convey some form of security. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even seem to breathe properly. The world around her was noise, voices, hurried footsteps, metal clashing against wood, but for her, everything was reduced to that point of contact with the horse. As if she believed that, as long as she was there, Silverdust wouldn't give up. John saw her. He thought about asking her to step aside, but the moment he opened his mouth to speak, he realized that would break something he didn't yet understand, so he said nothing. He just watched, with a discomfort he couldn't translate, how that 6-year-old girl had perceived what all of them experienced men, trainers, veteran cowboys, had ignored. When the trailer arrived, John and 2 workers positioned the ramps. Extreme care was needed. One wrong move could ruin everything. They used wide straps to try and lift Silverdust slowly, with as much stability as possible. The horse tried to breathe more deeply, as if sensing the men's touch and the urgency of the moment. The farmhands worked with extreme care, talking to the horse in low voices, asking for strength, asking for cooperation. Nora followed every movement, standing up only when one of the men needed to pass close to her. As soon as Silverdust was placed inside the trailer, partially supported, partially resting on the bars, the girl approached again, touching his neck with the same gentleness as before, and then something extraordinary happened. Albeit small, the horse opened and closed one of its nostrils, almost as if recognizing the horse. Miguel saw, John saw, and nobody said anything, but everyone felt it. As the trailer was being closed and the final preparations were made for the rush to the nearest veterinary clinic, the entire ranch seemed to breathe together for the first time that morning. The workers were tense, anxious, but there was something more there, an unexpected respect for the small, red-haired figure who had prevented a silent tragedy. Even the usually indifferent backhoe operator watched Nora with a heavy look of recognition, as if realizing he had almost made an irreparable mistake. The narrator then makes a gentle pause, a natural pause that doesn't break the emotion of the moment, but keeps pace with the rhythm of the story. A pause that acknowledges that, on this side of the screen, the viewer also needs to breathe, needs to absorb what happened, needs to reflect on the impact of that scream that changed everything. And then the question comes, sincere, engaging, emotional, yet discreet. Have you ever seen a child see what no one else has seen? Have you ever experienced something like that? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The pause is short, almost imperceptible, like the kind of pause a good storyteller would make before continuing the story. It creates connection, draws the audience in, without interrupting the dramatic flow. And while it happens, we see Nora still with her hand resting on Silverdust's neck. The trailer ready to leave, the sun finally rising between the mountains, illuminating a child who, without planning anything, had just changed the destiny of that entire ranch. Tension at the veterinary clinic, rural road leading to the city. The trailer door slammed shut with a dry bang, and immediately John McCready turned the truck's key, making the engine roar to life with a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the chest of anyone nearby. He pulled the steering wheel sharply, and the truck sped out of the ranch, raising a narrow trail of dust that dissolved in the cool morning air. The dirt road snaked between vast pastures, old fences, and distant hills that seemed blue under the pale sunlight, still struggling to break through the low fog. John drove fast, much faster than he was used to on Wyoming roads. His hands were so tense on the steering wheel that his fingers turned white, and his gaze fixed on the road seemed to want to pierce the dust and see the veterinary hospital before he even got there. The silence inside the cabin was heavy. John breathed deeply, a mixture of fear and regret making it difficult to even keep his breathing steady. With every turn, every bump, he wondered how he had been able to make such a rash decision. Every time the trailer swayed behind the pickup truck, he felt his stomach churn, not from the movement, but from the feeling that he was carrying much more than an injured horse. He was carrying his conscience, his mistake, his responsibility. On the bench beside her, Nora sat cross-legged, almost huddled inside her oversized jacket. She leaned forward whenever she could, trying to peek through the trailer's small side window, even though she knew she'd only see shadows and blurry movements. But she persisted, as if, just by being there, Silver Dust could sense she hadn't left. Her breath was short, and occasionally her lips moved in a whisper that sounded more like a secret prayer, something far more intimate than words. "Stay with me, please. Stay with me." Every time she said that, even softly, it was as if a wave of silence spread inside the truck, enveloping them both. John realized, though he didn't say anything, that this girl had more courage at that moment than he did. A grown man, owner of hundreds of acres, accustomed to making difficult decisions every day. Nora wasn't afraid to feel he wasn't afraid to care, and that made him feel small, smaller than he had ever felt before. When they left the dirt road and entered the paved road toward the small town where the veterinary clinic was located, the trailer shook less. The pickup truck accelerated more. The wind lashed against the windows, making a constant, empty sound that filled all the spaces John couldn't fill with words. The atmosphere was tense, urgent, but there was something more. There was the feeling that every minute counted, that every kilometer traveled was another line between life and death for Silver Dust. As she saw the city sign appearing in the distance, Nora leaned even closer to look at the trailer and, without realizing it, placed her hand on the truck's dashboard, as if she were holding the horse's breath through the metal, the dust, and the distance. And in that instant, even without looking at her, John felt something inside him break and reform at the same time, something he couldn't put into words, but knew wouldn't disappear anytime soon. Urgent diagnosis. As soon as the pickup truck rounded the final turn and entered the tight parking lot of the veterinary clinic, Nora had already unbuttoned her own jacket, as if that would get her ready faster, more able to help. John turned off the engine, opened the door so quickly that the hinge groaned, and ran to the trailer before even taking a deep breath. Two of the clinic's assistants, who had already been alerted by radio by one of the ranch workers, appeared beside the ramp before he got there, carrying straps, stabilizer bars, and a special stretcher for large animals. The trailer door opened, and the dark, stuffy, and dusty interior revealed Silver Dust breathing unevenly, his nostrils twitching just enough to show that there was still life there. The horse was partially supported by the grab bars, but his body felt too heavy, as if every muscle was fighting something invisible. Crumbles of dust clung to his gray coat, giving the animal an appearance that painfully mixed strength and fragility. Dr. Coleman appeared quickly, a woman in her 40s, with rectangular glasses and an expression always focused, even in emergencies. She observed everything with quick eyes, trained not to miss any detail. She touched the horse's neck, assessed its breathing, analyzed the rigidity of its muscles, and carefully felt the lateral region where Nora had noticed the movement. Each of her gestures had the precision of someone who had already seen the worst and the best that horses could endure. "Bring him inside, now," she ordered, without raising her voice. "He has mild internal bleeding. He's fighting. Every minute counts." The word hemorrhage stiffened John, as if he'd been punched in the chest. He had never let silver dust cross dangerous boundaries in training, but that fall had happened so quickly, so out of control, that it now seemed impossible to believe that a simple stumble could have put the horse between life and death. Nora watched everything closely, but she didn't cry. Her eyes were wide, attentive, absorbing every movement, every instruction, every expression of the veterinarian. She followed the group as they carefully pulled the horse out of the trailer. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and clean hay, an almost shocking contrast to the smell of dust and wet earth from the ranch. The white lamps reflected off the horse's coat, making silver dust seem even more fragile under that intense light. The assistants worked quickly. They put on oxygen tubes, adjusted IV stands, and administered medications that Nora didn't recognize, but which she watched as if each vial were a piece of the animal's life being returned to her. "He has a fracture in his right hind leg and is experiencing internal fluid loss. But he arrived in time," said the veterinarian, quickly examining him again. If he had arrived 10 or 15 minutes later, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Nora understood. John understood. Everyone there understood. And that silence, full of understanding, was heavier than any words the veterinarian could have said. A moral confrontation with a striking phrase. When the team finished stabilizing silver dust in the emergency room, John stood near the door, resting one hand on the metal rod, as if it were the only firm point at that moment. The white lights reflected on his face, but did not hide the heavy, anguished expression he rarely showed to anyone. He watched the veterinarian assess the horse, monitor its breathing, adjust the machines, and the more he watched, the more something inside him twisted forcefully. Nora stood beside him, silent. The girl could barely touch the floor with her feet when she sat in the plastic chair in the makeshift waiting room, but her gaze seemed much larger than her small body. She watched John as if she understood something he couldn't admit. The air inside was thick, almost difficult to breathe. Tension accumulated on those walls like dust gathered in old cracks. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, John released the breath he had been holding without realizing it. He turned to the girl, as if he could no longer contain it inside. He paused, squinting, as if arguing with himself. Then he began again, more quietly. "I saw nothing but the damage." The sound of that sentence seemed out of place with his voice. It was almost strange to hear John McCready admit something so vulnerable. He looked at the floor, shaking his head, as if he couldn't believe his own mistake, as if he were trying to understand how he had been so blind. He thought about how he had looked at silver dust that morning, not as a living being, but as a financial loss, a number, a problem to be solved quickly. And then, without hesitation, Nora answered, "He's not a number, he feels." The phrase came from her mouth simply, but with a depth that struck John like a direct blow. There was no judgment in the girl's tone. There was no anger, no contempt. It was simply the truth, pure, clear, impossible to deny. John's eyes trembled for a second. He looked at her, and for the first time that morning, perhaps for the first time in a long time, he seemed to truly see Nora. Not as a meddlesome child, not as the daughter of laborers, but as someone who was seeing what he, with all his experience, with all his authority, with all his power, had failed to see. Her words echoed through the room as if they had a life of their own. It was simple, but it carried all the layers of that day: the shock, the mistake, the saving cry, the race against time, and, above all, it carried something John had forgotten along the way: humanity. The veterinarian continued working, but the scene between them had already shaped a new path within the ranch, a path that began there, in that overly bright room, with a 6-year-old girl staring at a man who finally understood that he had much more to learn than he had imagined. Real hope. Minutes later, as the intensity of the emergency began to subside, Dr. Coleman wiped her hands on the disposable towel and walked over to John and Nora. Her expression was no longer the same as before. There was a slight relief on her face, a weariness mixed with the certainty that they had done everything they could. She bent down slightly, getting to Nora's level, before speaking. Perhaps because she understood that this little girl deserved to hear the news first. "Silver will recover," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "It will take time, it will require constant care, but he will be okay." The words fell on Nora like a warm blanket. She didn't smile immediately first. She blinked several times, as if her mind needed time to believe what she was hearing. Then, finally, the tension in her entire body dissolved. Her shoulders relaxed, and she released a long breath of pure relief, the kind that slowly deflates the chest. John looked away. He didn't want anyone to see how much those words had affected him. He took a few steps back, leaning against the overly white wall of the clinic. The fluorescent light above him accentuated the weariness on his face, an emotional, heavy weariness that had nothing to do with physical work. It was the weariness of someone who realized the magnitude of his own mistake and how much gratitude he owed to the smallest person in that room. As Nora watched Silver Dust being connected to the hydration and monitoring tubes, John brought his hand to his face, as if trying to erase the man he had been hours before. He remembered how he had declared the horse dead, without looking properly, without feeling, without listening, and now he saw, right there in front of him, the living proof that he had almost buried an animal that was still fighting for every breath. The veterinarian approached him again, this time with a more professional expression. She explained the treatment, the necessary care, the remaining risks, but her voice had a tone of confidence, the kind of confidence that only appears when the worst is over. And John listened to everything in silence, nodding occasionally, but without really being able to absorb all the information. He was still processing the fact that Silver Dust would live, that he would have a second chance, and John, too. When the veterinarian stepped away, Nora approached Silver Dust with the same gentleness with which one touches a broken wing. She placed her hand on his neck, which was now rising and falling more steadily, and stood there, quiet and still, as if that gesture were part of the treatment, and perhaps it was. It was evident to anyone who observed that Silver Dust reacted to her presence in a different way, as if, on the edge between life and death, he had recognized the only person who had heard what everyone else ignored. With Silver Dust finally stabilized, the cold, white room of the clinic gained an atmosphere of calm that hadn't existed minutes before. The sounds of the monitoring machine filled the silence, marking the slow, steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. Nora remained by his side, her hand resting on his Nochlin coat, and each time the horse inhaled a little more deeply, it seemed as if her heart breathed along with it. John watched from afar, not daring to interrupt that moment. The narrator then pauses gently, a pause deliberate, not meant to break the emotion, but to match the natural rhythm of the story, like a deep sigh after a huge scare. Like the rest, the body craves when life finally gives a sign that it's not going to collapse. It's the kind of pause that exists within the narrative itself, organic, that matches the state of the viewer. Because after so much tension, the audience also needs to breathe. This pause is brief, respectful, but completely captivating. If this twist resonated with you, if you've ever experienced a moment where everything seemed lost and, suddenly, something changed, leave a like. It helps a lot. It's a natural pause, perfect for long videos. It doesn't disrupt the emotional flow. It doesn't pull the audience out of the immersion. It simply invites viewers to participate, to share this moment, to connect with the story in the same way that Nora connected with Silver Dust. And as those words echo, we see Nora still holding the horse's neck, the morning sun streaming through the narrow clinic window and illuminating her face. We see John standing a few steps away, his posture still rigid, but with different eyes, no longer hard, no longer calculating, but attentive, humble, transformed. The pause ends, but the feeling doesn't, because from that point on, the McCready Ranch would never be the same again, and neither would Silverdust. A change at the ranch, returning under the soft light of dusk. The sun was already setting behind the mountains when John's truck turned back onto the dirt road leading to the ranch. The orange light of late afternoon spread across the fields, creating long shadows that moved as the vehicle advanced. It wasn't the same kind of light they had seen when they left that morning. It was warmer, calmer, as if the day itself was trying to announce that something had changed in the air. Nora watched out the window, tired, but with the kind of tiredness that comes after a huge scare, combined with profound relief. Her hands were still a little dusty from the clinic, and her crumpled jacket carried the vague smell of antiseptic mixed with the scent of the ranch itself. John drove slower now, like someone who needed time to digest everything that had happened. When the pickup truck stopped, several workers were already waiting at the entrance to the barn. Some had their arms crossed, others leaned on their tools, unsure how to react, but clearly anxious. They had seen John's expression as he left hours earlier, and knew that morning had been more serious than just an accident. Now, at dusk, everyone was trying to guess the outcome, just from the farmer's posture as he got out of the vehicle. Nora followed right behind, still holding the door handle, as if the world were too big for her to process so quickly. The silence among the workers was dense, full of questions that no one dared to ask. And it was in this silence that John walked towards them, with heavier steps than usual, his face carrying a mixture of shame, respect, and something close to gratitude. The entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. John admits his mistakes. John stood before the workers like someone who had finally understood the weight of his own actions. He took a deep breath, removed his hat, and ran a hand through his gray hair. A rare gesture of someone needing to compose himself before speaking. The men exchanged glances, expecting him to give instructions, orders, reprimands, anything typical of the tough farmer they knew. But what came was completely different. With a firm voice, but laden with something they weren't used to hearing, John said he had been wrong. He admitted there, before everyone, that he had acted impulsively, arrogantly, hastily. He said that, if it weren't for little Nora, Silverdust would be dead at that moment. He said this, looking the workers in the eye, one by one, as if he wanted to ensure everyone understood the gravity of what he was saying. Some men lowered their heads, others widened their eyes in surprise, not at the horse's survival, but at the rancher admitting, in front of everyone, that he had made such a big mistake. John explained that he had let the animal's financial value, competitive value, overshadow the fact that it was a living being, and that this little girl had been the only one able to see what he hadn't. He also said that he would never again make decisions of this kind, without looking properly, without feeling properly, without listening to those who might have something important to say, regardless of their age or position on the ranch. The silence that followed was profound. It was as if everyone had witnessed something historic at the McCready Ranch, something that changed how the boss himself saw himself. And there, beside John, Nora seemed even smaller, yet paradoxically larger, because that entire speech existed thanks to the cry she had dared to utter. New skincare routine. With the news of Silverdust's possible recovery, the ranch began to operate at a different pace. The next day and in the days that followed, the routine wasn't just hard work and obligations. There was a new air circulating through the stables, a mixture of hope and responsibility. Every morning, before any other activity began, John authorized Nora to go to the truck so he could take her to the veterinary clinic. The girl sat on the same seat where she had spent the most tense trip of her life, but now her gaze was illuminated by the simple fact of knowing that Silver Dust was alive. When they arrived at the clinic, the veterinarian would sometimes smile at the sight of the small, red-haired figure briskly entering, almost always holding a piece of carrot or sliced apple. Nora would approach Silver carefully and position herself in her usual spot to the left of his neck. The monitors would beep regularly, and each time the horse moved his ears or nostril, even slightly, upon recognizing her presence, the assistants would comment admiringly that the animal seemed to change the rhythm of its own recovery when Nora was around. She spoke to him in a low voice, always repeating that he was strong, that he would get better, that he still had many races ahead of him, not because he was a champion horse, but because he was loved, because there were people who now truly saw him. Silver Dust, even weakened, would make a slight movement of his head whenever he heard her voice, as if that were enough to bring him calm. And this ritual girl and Horseby came an essential part of the healing, something that no one dared interrupt. On the ranch, the workers began to notice this new dynamic. They often commented amongst themselves that it seemed the horse was waiting for its daily visitor. MacCready, who had always been seen as distant, began to observe the scene attentively, almost silently. And, day after day, something changed within him, not suddenly, but in a slow and profound way. Gratitude transformed into action. John MacCready's transformation wasn't just words. After a few days observing Nora's dedication and realizing how much the girl had influenced his own change in attitude, he made decisions that surprised everyone on the ranch. First, he called Nora's parents in for a talk. They arrived apprehensive, thinking they had done something wrong or that their daughter's presence in the barn had bothered the boss. But John received them with a tone he rarely used, a respectful, almost cordial tone. He explained that he had been saved from making an irreversible mistake thanks to their daughter. He said she had seen life where he had only seen cost, and that this had affected him more than any competition, any prize, or any work crisis. And then, without ceremony, he announced that he would improve the family's working and living conditions. He said they would no longer have to worry about rent, that they would get a raise, that they would have more stability, and, in addition, he looked directly at Nora and said that she would have free access to the stables whenever she wanted, because it was clear to everyone that the animals, especially Silver Dust, reacted well to her presence. The parents were speechless. The father tried to thank them, but his voice failed him. Mom wiped away a tear that had escaped uncontrollably. And Nora just smiled, a small, shy, but genuine smile, as if that change was just another natural reflection of what she had done, not to be recognized, but because it was the right thing to do. The workers talked about that gesture for days. Some said they had never seen MacCready so different, so human. Others claimed that Nora had done more for the ranch in a single day than many adults had done in years. But everyone agreed on one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. The day Silver Dust finally managed to stand, even briefly, was almost like a silent holiday for the entire ranch. The news arrived early, by phone, and John made sure to call Nora and take her to the clinic personally. When they entered the room, the veterinarian smiled in a way that said more than any technical report. Silver was standing with the help of supports, still weak, still trembling, but alive, completely alive. Nora walked slowly toward him, with the gentle step she always used when near animals. The horse stirred as soon as it sensed her presence, slowly raising its head, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. Silver's large, dark eyes followed her as she approached, and when Nora raised her hand, it tilted its neck, drawing closer with effort, but with a clear purpose. She rested her forehead against his, exactly where she had placed her hand on the day of the accident. She closed her eyes, held her breath for a few seconds, and whispered softly, but so full of feeling that even John, standing a few steps behind, felt a warm pang in his chest. "I knew you hadn't given up on breathing." Silver Dust released a slow, warm puff of air, as if in response. It was one of those moments that no one needs to narrate. Within the story, it speaks for itself. It speaks of hope, of courage, of humility, of how a little girl, on a large ranch, managed to change everything, simply because she decided to look closely, when everyone else only looked from afar. And that late afternoon, with the sun streaming through the clinic window and illuminating the horse's gray coat, it became clear to anyone present that it wasn't just Silver Dust who had been saved. The entire ranch had been saved along with him.